Welcome, everyone, to the Academy of Ideas podcast filmed. And I'm Claire Fox. I'm the director of the Academy of Ideas. And we are here to discuss, wait for it, folks, the Public Authorities Fraud, Error and Recovery Bill. Now, don't turn off, because we're looking at a very specific part of it, the new eligibility verification powers. Don't turn off. I know that in a very busy world in which we've got Trump madness, tariffs, trade deals, we've got war between Israel and Gaza, we've got, the day we're filming, a huge announcement on an immigration reset. This afternoon in the House of Lords, I'm going to be discussing the use of digital ID as a way of bringing in self-ID in relation to gender, something I feel passionately opposed to. You'd think that, why are you, the Academy of Ideas, discussing the Public Authorities Fraud, Error and Recovery Bill? Well, I'm here to tell you why. This bill, which is actually going to be discussed in the House of Lords on Friday, actually has very serious civil liberties implications. The Liberal Democrats, who I don't often or always agree with, have said that the bill presents opportunities for Orwellian levels of mass surveillance for those who get means-tested benefits. And they've called it a Big Brother bill, something akin to a modern snooper's charter. And the SNP, Kirsty Blackman, says it will treat people as guilty rather than beginning from the point of view that they are innocent. And so I think that this is something which, it's one of those pieces of legislation that's going through and not enough public outcry is happening. Although one organisation that has tried to create that public outcry, and I think has alerted me to the seriousness of this, is Big Brother Watch. So I am delighted that one of the main guest, in a way, no disrespect to my second guest, is Jasleen Chaggar, who is the Legal and Policy Officer at Big Brother Watch. Jasleen, it's great to have you here. Jasleen focuses on data rights, financial privacy, surveillance technology, and she writes a bi-weekly roundup of developments in media law for the International Forum for Responsible Media. So, Jasleen, I'm delighted you're here, but I've also asked Timandra Harkness to join us. Timandra is a friend of the Academy of Ideas. I hope, Jasleen, you will become one. A regular attendee and speaker at the annual Battle of Ideas Festival that we have every October. Timandra, for those of you who don't know, is the author of Technology is Not the Problem. That's her latest book. And also Big Data Does Size Matter, a bestseller that she wrote a few years ago. She's a journalist and broadcaster and has written and presented a variety of series for BBC Radio 4, including Future Proofing and Data Everywhere, which is obviously relevant to what we're talking about. Not related to that, but two of my favourites that she also did was How to Disagree and Steel Manning. And Timandra is also a trustee of the Royal Statistical Society. So welcome to you both. So, Jasleen, just give us a brief overview. We're going to dig deep into this, but give us a brief overview of what is it about this bill and that particular eligibility verification clause that you are worried about most.
You're absolutely right that it's a horribly unsexy title for this bill, and we prefer the term banks buying powers.
That sounds so much better.
It does.
I should have started with that, so I hope you haven't turned off yet.
So the banks buying powers would essentially allow the DWP to require banks to scan everyone's bank accounts to find people who are in receipt of benefits and who match what they're calling eligibility indicators. So that's something that makes it look like you shouldn't be receiving benefits. It might be that you have capital savings over £16,000 and you're in receipt of universal credit, or you're traveling abroad a lot. And so the government is essentially deputizing the banks to investigate its customers, find out who looks like they might not be receiving the right benefits, whether that's due to fraud or error, including the DWP's own errors, I would add. And then the bank would be required to report back to the DWP and flag that individual for potential further investigation. There are a lot of questions surrounding how the powers will work in practice. The government has promised that the codes of practice will, fill in a lot of the detail. We're yet to see them, and the bill is coming into the Lords later this week, and so that's why this is particularly pressing at this time.
So, if I can just ask you, a broad context here, and then Timandra, if you want to pick up anything, is that I think that many of our viewers and listeners will, like myself in fact, be exasperated by the fact that public money is ripped off, right? So we've moved beyond the kind of benefit scrounger rhetoric. But on the other hand, there are times, and it was particularly true during COVID, and in fact, the government are making much of this, where you just felt that people were just taking the piss. And just kind of like claiming grants and so on and so forth, not paying back. And there are people who are undoubtedly playing the system. And so I can understand a lot of sympathy with any government attempt at clawing that back, stopping it happening, disincentivizing it. But yet there's something about the way they're going about it that seems to have a more generalised effect. But I suppose the other thing that I'm confused about is, haven't they got a lot of power? This is one of the things that really concerns me. Even now, I think the current system, and I'm quoting the DWP themselves, is that they can request bank account holders' transaction details as and when. And if they're suspicious of fraud, right? So they can actually ask banks for bank statements to evaluate and reevaluate the claim. So why is this worse? What's going on there? And if, Jasleen, you come back first, and then Timandra, anything you want to pick up?
Just on your first point, you're absolutely right that there is a serious problem with fraud in this country. We know that when you see the numbers, they are astounding, and something should be done about that. Our position is that we need the right powers that are proportionate and privacy preserving to tackle the problem, rather than using this sledgehammer to crack a nut. In regard to the powers the DWP already have to tackle fraud and error, you're right. They can go and request bank statements from welfare recipients, and that, those in themselves contain incredibly granular financial information that give them all the powers they need where there is a suspicion of fraud having taken place. What these powers do is reverse the presumption of innocence, and you're almost treating anyone in receipt of state support as a suspect by default, that we have to just go behind their bank account and just check to make sure that they aren't, receiving anything they shouldn't be. So it's incredibly offensive, and one of the real sticking points is that it's going to target some of the most marginalized people in society. Some of the poorest people, disabled people, elderly people, carers, single parents are all going to be disproportionately targeted by these powers. And so there are equality implications as well.
Timandra, anything you want to pick up at this stage?
Well, I think the thing that's, you've pretty much said there, at least implicitly, is that it takes away the presumption of innocence. So it takes away the assumption that if you claim benefits, you are entitled to them, or at least you believe you are entitled to them, and introduces the idea that everybody is a potential benefit cheat, and that justifies surveying. But it's not only the bank accounts of people who claim benefits, because it's linked bank accounts. So it would be if you had arranged to have your housing benefit paid direct to your landlord, or if you had a shared bank account with a spouse, or maybe if you had got regular payments from your parents, or made regular payments to children, then all of those people who aren't even claimants would suddenly find that the banks are algorithmically scanning their behavior. And I think that's a huge shift. It does remind me of one of the Digital Powers Acts, where the presumption goes from, look, we do have the powers if we suspect somebody of serious crime, whatever. We actually do have the powers to go to the technology companies and say, please give us this information. We want to know what this person's up to. An attempt to shift from that to widespread surveillance and the powers to just look at everybody's social media accounts or online activity or whatever, in trawling for possible patterns that might indicate something that ought to be investigated.
A couple of things that I don't quite understand. I mean, first of all, in order to identify the very specific people who are on these benefits, the banks have to trawl through everybody's accounts to check who's on the benefits. So to a certain extent, it means that the banks are looking differently at their customer base. I mean, they start to have to look, and they're doing so under instruction from the government for suspicion. Right. So first of all, they have to go, oh, this is part of the fraud bill thing, isn't it? Where we're kind of, and we have to check now. So you start looking. So they're not just objectively assessing it for themselves. So there's that. I think you're absolutely right to point out that it's linked accounts as well. And very often people in receipt of these benefits will have another party, a family member or a carer or a guardian or whatever involved. And so that it brings all those things in. I think I find it also disconcerting that the government thinks it's acceptable to ask the private sector. It just outsources its responsibility and says, we can't catch them. So we want you to do this bit and then pass it over to us, anyone. And that seems to me to be an overreach of state power, because it's like, well, fine, you catch them, but you're the DWP, you get them, but no, you're now dragging in all these financial institutions.
But that's very common in the digital realm. If I just jump back in, that when we think about privacy, for example, and we say, well, I don't want the government looking at what I do online, but I don't mind companies doing it because they're only interested for commercial reasons to sell me, push advertising at me. And I always think, yes, but that's a mistake, because actually governments and states have no hesitation about going to the private companies and saying, we want access to this information. And so it's very porous. It's very difficult to see a boundary there. And governments, by doing that, they absolve themselves of the responsibility. And that really is like the Online Safety Act, because they want to control what is said and shared online, but they don't want to put themselves in a position of having to actually do government censorship and laying down clear laws about what we may and may not say and share online. So they say, oh, well, it might be harmful or illegal, but we're going to make the companies and the platforms decide that. But then if they fail, in our view, then we'll punish them. So they're outsourcing responsibility for censorship and surveillance.
I know that's so. I mean, just to give the government's case. So the government says that there are limitations on the type of data that can be shared. It's limited and it excludes the sharing of transaction data, e.g., and it actually says this, that they don't want to know what someone spent their money on, or special category data, which is in relation to an individual's health, ethnic origin, or political opinion. I mean, the fact that they have to state that in 2025 is an indication of the fact that the public are going, you just want to debank us for our political opinions, or you're checking out on our protected characteristics or whatever. But anyway, they say, no, don't worry. They basically accuse the likes of Big Brother Watch, but there's many other organisations like Amnesty and so on, any civil libertarian, of hyperbole at this point. They're basically saying, oh, stop saying bank spying powers. That's not what it is. They then say the power can only be used on accounts which receive a relevant DWP benefit payment and accounts linked to that account. So we've already established that that's problematic from our point of view. But, they're saying, no, you only can look at the accounts that receive relevant DWP benefits. But as I say, that means the banks have to then do that trawling. And then this is the one I love. Banks and financial institutions can be issued with penalty notices for non-compliance. So there's a threat there. So the banks have force to do it. But the bit that's hilarious is that you also can be fined for oversharing. So they've gone out of their way to say, but also, if the bank give us too much data or the wrong data, we're going to punish them. So you shouldn't worry your pretty little heads, because they won't do anything too awful. But they are financially penalising any bank that doesn't comply and within a time frame. So this is quite a draconian measure in my view. But just in terms of what they're arguing their justification of, no, it's only limited, it's proportionate and so on. Any thoughts?
Well, for context, these are a resurrection of conservative powers that did a similar thing, but sort of even more indiscriminately. So there are now protections that mean that when the banks share data back to the DWP, they can't hand over bank statements. What their flag will give is the name of the account holder, the account number, and why they've been flagged and meeting these eligibility indicators, among other things. That's what's on the face of the bill. Our concern is that it's sort of a circular safeguard, because once that data has been handed over to the DWP, they're going to go back to the bank and investigate further. And so we know they already have the powers to request bank statements. So we're concerned that it could be the case that the DWP get the name and account number of this person and then say, well, that's, along with some other information, this means that they are a suspect. And so they can very easily go and get that granular financial data, even though that safeguard is ostensibly on the surface. In our view, it's not enough protection.
Yeah, but also, Timandra, it seems to me that, it is true that if you have an authoritarian state that spies on everything, that probably certain nefarious illegal activities would be prohibited. But we are supposed to live in a free society. So, if they bugged everybody's houses, they would be able to hear people planning robberies, for example, right? I mean, you can say, well, look, we're not doing anything wrong because we're just simply finding out if there's anyone doing anything dodgy. We don't want you to be concerned, but we know that, and it might well be that they're going to catch more people this way. But it's the principle, it seems to me. We can go on as to whether this will be effective or whether it's even what the priority of a government should be. I did want to just thank Jasleen, though, for mentioning the Tories, because this is quite important, because actually it was under a different guise that this was going to be brought in through the Data Protection and Digital Information Bill. And I was kind of already thinking that was where I was going to be intervening when the Conservatives were doing, but it kind of fell off the radar because of that early Rishi Sunak general election. So and the Tories' proposals were worse. And in fact, I know that in the Lords, Baroness Maeve Sherlock, as was from NUS in my day, who's a very, very, actually I have to say, one of the best ministers I've seen in the Lords. She really knows her stuff. So I'm anxious about going up against her because she's not a slouch on these questions. But she's been very clear in her correspondence with us to say, look, we've listened there and we have narrowed it down. And that is all true. But nonetheless, these are sweeping powers. And on principle, it just seems wrong to me that the state forces banks to themselves be the ones who do the surveillance for the government, with all sorts of potential precedent-setting powers there.
Yeah, and it is interesting, as you say, that the powers have been somewhat tightened up since the original Conservative proposals, which, I remember that bill, and there was very widespread disquiet amongst civil liberties campaigners and privacy campaigners over exactly that and other parts of it. But it is all part of a very widespread trend, not only by this government, but other governments and other countries in the world, I think, towards saying, the old thing, if you've got nothing to hide, you've got nothing to fear, and why should you worry about the state looking into things? And it's for your own protection. And why are you worried? And it's not going to be a human looking at your bank account. It's going to be an algorithm doing it. So it's actually still private. And there's, I think for me, that's the most worrying thing, is just this presumption that actually very widespread automated surveillance is fine because you're only trying to catch the bad guys. So if you're not one of the bad guys, you've got nothing to worry about. Whereas, I just think on principle that's a problem. But on a practical terms, there are many potential problems. One of them is that these algorithmic systems don't tend to work very well. I mean, the Horizon scandal is still trickling on, and that was precisely one where they said, "Oh well, the computer must be reliable, so let's believe the computer." And loads of people had their lives ruined with that. But there's also the thing of you may look at this government now and say they are drawing the line in the right place about which things are red flags and what is an acceptable level of fraud or error, and how we should treat people who are very poor and on benefits. But you absolutely, once these powers are in place, you have no control over how future governments will use them. And there's always that creep of, well, if it works for this and we work for that. And actually one of the things which I think was possibly in the Big Brother Watch briefing on this is that they've rolled in claimant fraud and claimant error into the same bucket, so that whether you have deliberately set out to game the system and invent relatives that you don't have and make claims for things that are fictional, or whether you simply have been baffled by the system, which is increasingly online and by phone, and you can't just go in and sit in an office and say, I've lost my job and I have no idea how to claim, and have a reasonably friendly human talk you through it. And so you can wrongly declare things, and now you're going to be treated the same as someone who's potentially deliberately defrauding. And this widespread assumption of guilt will go across everybody.
I think what's interesting on the algorithmic side of things is that at the same time that this bill is going through, the data bill is going through. And that has all sorts of implications for automated decision making. Now, at the moment, the government is saying on this bill, the Public Authorities Bill, that a human will always be involved in the final decision of whether to investigate someone on the basis of a bank's flag. But it's not baked in on the face of the bill. And that's one of the concerns we have, because with the data bill, more and more decisions are going to be able to be made completely in an automated fashion without any human involvement. So there is a real justifiable fear here that this bank's spying and scanning could then happen in a completely automated way with that check removed. So that's another real issue as well.
So I want to just move on to something on checks and balances. I mean, first of all, to note that although this bill limits the particular DWP benefits to 3, I think, is that right?
Universal credit, employment and support allowance, and pension credit.
And pension credit. It basically says, by the way, your national pension, the pension is not included. So that's its kind of reassurance. And then it says, it's only 3. And then it reserves the right of the Secretary of State, because as usual with every bill that comes through now, there are powers, delegated powers that will be used by the executive. That means that a Secretary of State in the future can broaden that out. So there can be other claimants. So your suspicions are right, I mean, for a start off. But also I think this question of the codes of practice is very important. Mm-hmm. When I was reading the government's own material on this, it was consistently the case that it deferred the detail to codes of conduct. So, codes of conduct. I keep saying codes of conduct because other bills are trying to bring in codes of conduct about how we all live our lives. But anyway, codes of practice. It kept saying, we will be working out in consultation with, the details of how this part of the bill will happen, how this part. And that was the government. And then I was approached by Big Brother Watch because there was a number of MPs who were very concerned that these codes of practice didn't exist. And the Commons was coming to the end of its run, and they'd been debating it all. And I just cannot see how it's possible. Timandra, off camera, you and I were talking about how they did a lot of the delegated powers and things like the Online Safety Act. So there's already a tendency for governments of all colours to take away from parliamentary scrutiny, or therefore democratic scrutiny, therefore the eyes of the public, what they're going to do with the detail, the dotting the I's and crossing the T's. But these are particular to each section of this bill. It says You need to know what's in the codes of practice. And then they haven't produced them. Now, I don't know whether we're any further in knowing whether they will ever appear before the Lords discuss.
They have been promised for committee stage in the Lords, so they will be
Which
seen...
is atrocious, by the way, because it gives far too much power to the Lords, which is, again, as it goes, anti-democratic. But anyway.
I mean, asking MPs to vote on something that they haven't seen the full detail of is really shocking. And again and again, it came up when witnesses were giving evidence to the Bill Committee that, unless we see how this is going to work in practice, we can't really say whether it's going to be proportionate. And, it's very... few and far between that civil society agrees with the banks and the private sector. But on this bill, the banks are also concerned, and they'd rather be fighting serious financial crime as well. And so it's really widespread, the concern.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to just kind of quote a couple of the bankers in relation to this, because Helen Woods, who's the director of CFAS, an NGO with expertise in limiting fraud and financial crime, not so much as civil libertarian. She said that in order to judge the bill's limits and the use of powers, and she says, because there is the highest risk, we need to be able to see whether these powers will use the highest risk of high-end investigations rather than making it a blanket power. So that's what their concern was. And then the Director of Economic Crime Policy at the UK Finance, David Chaggar, said he wants to be able to see the details of specific criteria against which the government will mandate banks to perform checks. Because the other thing that we haven't said is the government is going to tell the banks you've got to check, and they are then going to supply them with eligibility criteria, with a specific criteria. But we don't know what that is, and they don't know what that is. And they keep saying, well, I don't know why you're worried. It's like, well, we want to know what the criteria, what are you going to ask the banks? I mean, is it going to be, have they spent too much of their money on going to the races or going on holiday? I mean, they can say, don't be ridiculous, Baroness Fox, which they will. And I'll say, well, I don't know, because you haven't told us. And that's what the concerns are. So there's that.
Well, they do. I mean, they have already mentioned, haven't they, travel abroad. So if you are somebody who has extended family abroad, and you make regular trips to see your elderly parents or whatever, this could see you automatically flagged up as a potential benefit fraudster for completely, reasons that are nobody's business, frankly.
Yeah.
And if it's going to be as broad as a lot of travel abroad, then exactly, it could be that. It could be, why do you eat out so much? Why do you spend so much on clothes? I mean, like, who knows what things are going to be deemed? It's like, we're almost back to the deserving and the undeserving poor, aren't we? It's like, well, we'll give you benefits, but you can't have nice things.
No, but you're absolutely right, because, the reason why this sort of rings a bell for me is because I had a massive row a couple of years ago, and it still sort of rings true in my mind, about affordability checks on people who gamble. And this was it's not in the law, but it's been campaigned and lobbied for. But in the discussion on that with, some very eminent politicians, there really was, well, we need to check that they're spending their money responsibly. And I made the point that I have been known to irresponsibly go shopping and blow a lot of money on things I can't afford. I didn't want the banks to be talking to the government about whether I was living within my means. I mean, it's up to me to manage my own money and to decide what it is I spend. I mean, they've got a particular thing about gambling, but I was making the point, it's got nothing to do with you. The bank can alert me if they think I'm going into overdraft. That's a different question. That's a technical question.
Yeah.
It was the nature of what transactions are occurring that would flag up. And of course, in some instances, people spend a lot of money on gambling, but maybe they do that and they decide to not go shopping like I might. I mean, that's what choices people have. So all the time you feel as though you're on the defensive about living in a free society. Like, I'm a free individual in a free society. I just happen to be on benefits. I didn't know that I was going to be, as you say, a lesser person.
Well, exactly. It's like, it's one of the very basic principles of living in a liberal society in the very broadest sense, that other people must be free to make life choices that you don't necessarily think are the right choices even for them. Well, that is what freedom is. We make our own life choices, and sometimes other people won't agree with those life choices. Well, that's really a much broader question about morality in society. It's not the business of the DWP and my bank to go trawling through and holding me against these criteria and say, well, yeah, I'm sorry, you haven't spent nearly enough on fresh vegetables, and you spent far too much on going out.
I'm feeling guilty already. Right, let's just a couple of things to kind of just finish off with. First of all, there are other things in this bill. We're just looking at these particular clauses, but there are other things that are slightly worrying. They are lowering the bar, for example, for taking money out of an individual's bank account and removing people's driving licenses. Could you expand on this at all? Because these are not, these are penalties. And you could say, well, these are people who are, by the way, probably, I mean, that we're more now talking about people who have committed fraud, what they do about reclaiming money. But anyway, nonetheless, it feels a bit icky to me.
It actually isn't people who have committed fraud.
Oh, isn't it? Oh, there you go.
It's people who have sometimes fraud, but sometimes where there's been mistakes, negligent oversights. And it's people who owe money to the DWP but are no longer in work or in receipt of benefits. So it's a sort of separate group of individuals.
Oh, right.
But the idea is that if they are failing to engage with the DWP, the DWP can then go behind their backs and ask for 3 months of their bank statements from their bank to check whether they can afford to have the money deducted directly from their bank account. And if they continue to fail to engage, they'll just take the money straight away. At the moment, the government gets that money back through a judicial process and county court orders. But this debt recovery power would sort of, in their view, streamline the process, and in our view, have a completely disproportionate response to getting money back in cases where it can be because someone has been overpaid by an accident, no fault of their own as well. Similarly, when the bank debt recovery powers can't be used as a sort of final power of last resort, these individuals can have their driving licenses removed. And our concern is that we're viewing it as a poverty penalty, because at this point you've already been through their bank account and determined that they can't afford to have the money deducted in the first place. So the unintended consequence is it's going to be the poorest people who might not be engaging with the DWP because of their life circumstances, because they've got an ill relative or they're ill themselves. And if they're not engaging, then they're going to have their driving license removed as well. There is, court oversight for the driving license removals, but it's a scary, slippery descent into a real dystopian power, in our view.
Yeah, they're also ensuring that a lot of the penalties will be civil penalties. As they themselves boast, the advantage of this is that, therefore, it has to live up to the civil burden of proof, which is on the balance of probabilities rather than the criminal burden of proof. And you could say, well, you won't get a criminal record, but we also know that you won't get due process. It's also the case that you won't be offered a choice between a civil penalty and a criminal prosecution. So what's happened is they're bringing in this basically lowering the burden of proof so that they can issue penalties. That's the outcome of it. And there's more and more examples of this. The Manifesto Club has done an awful lot of work. Another civil liberties organisation has done an awful lot of work on the issuing of civil penalties and civil notices and so all these kind of things, which is, it gives power to people who then kind of like brandish it. You don't have to go through the courts in the same way. People are told, I mean, they aren't given a choice, but in a way they're also told, look, you've just got a civil notice. It doesn't matter. It doesn't go on your criminal record. But the problem is you can't defend yourself in the same way, and they don't have to prove as much. Yeah. So you can tell that there's going to potentially be real injustices here.
I think the driving license thing is particularly pernicious because it redefines what a driving license is. I mean, currently a driving license is something that anybody can get if they can demonstrate that they can drive safely. And then if you demonstrate that you can't drive safely, then it can be taken away again, usually temporarily. But all of that makes sense in that you say the basic standard is that everybody is free to drive. It's a basic part of your mobility, your freedom to get around. And we just want to make sure that you're not going to endanger yourself or other road users. But as long as that's the case, then off you go. But this starts to treat it as a privilege. As well, driving's only for people who've been good, and you haven't been good in areas completely unrelated to driving, and so you no longer have that privilege. And that, it's a different issue in a way, but I do think that's part of that idea that the freedom to move around is a privilege, and you can't take it for granted. You plebs, the fact that you might want to travel the country in an independent motor vehicle is. We've granted you as a favour, but if you're naughty, we'll take it away again.
Yeah, no, that is worrying. I think, Timandra, you've mentioned, I think, and this is something that I know that Big Brother Watch Jasleen has emphasised, which is the treatment of fraud and error in a conflated fashion. And the bill, defines the two, and it makes it clear that error is not intentional. But the problem is that the actions to deal with it are the same, and it's the same bill. And I think, Jasleen, you're very often the error is accidental, but it often comes about from the system, it seems to me. The DWP themselves make overpayments, probably because things are done algorithmically as it happens, or carelessness or whatever. But anyway, nonetheless, overpayments are made. And we've seen terrible examples over recent years, particularly of carers, actually, who have been, they're suddenly, they literally haven't got time. They kind of apply, they kind of go back to the child that they're looking after 24/7 with the most severe disabilities, and they can't, barely have time to sleep a few weeks themselves. Is not an enviable position. And the next minute they get a 25 grand bill or something, right, until they have to pay it because they've been overpaid over a whole range of years, and it's been small amounts that have accrued, and then there's fines and all sorts of things. And I'm really worried about that because I think that there's more of that could happen. But the other thing is, in terms of this bill's prioritising the culprit, there is not as much effort going into tackling that as there is in pursuing the error, the people, getting the money from the people who've been overpaid. And I do worry that this bill is a lot of work for not a lot of reward. Now, I'm not suggesting people should get away with fraud, but with the error side to it, I do think that we're not looking at the right people. I mean, why aren't we looking at DWP staff and systems? So, well, why do you keep overpaying? Why do people not understand the system? Why is it so confusing and complicated? You're admitting that they haven't done it fraudulently. That's possibly because they can't work out what you're trying to get at in these fantastically labyrinthine rules that you've got in terms of welfare. I mean, any thoughts on that side of things?
Yeah, I think the carers example is a great illustration of where the department already has powers or access to data where people were being flagged for having been overpaid, and there wasn't anything done about it, and that's why these debts accumulated. So there is already enough information available. There is enough data that they have access to, and these powers are really a disproportionate measure that isn't really going to solve the problem.
I also think, just in terms of money, because I have to say that I have been outraged by in a kind of slightly Daily Mail type way, about the Motability scandal, if you see what I mean, and the number of people who can gain access to cars and vehicles and so on, because it became a scam, right? Now, I don't mean everybody who's got a car on Motability is a scammer. And Motability have just announced, that they are tightening up the system. And it's like, well, there's no surprise. And I'm not even blaming people. I mean, if somebody says to you, do you know you can get a free car, all you have to do is say this, it's like, I wish I'd known, you can understand it. But that was a system that the government had in place. And I think that one of the things that's depressing for me is that there's almost inbuilt into the system has been an incentivizing of welfare dependence. This is a broader political point that nobody has to agree with me on. But there has been incentivizing of welfare dependence if in some ways I know people who can't afford to work, or even if they work a bit, they're going to lose benefits and so on. And so they don't, and they want to work. And the whole thing is just like sort of barking mad, because you just think we want people to be engaged in there and so on. Some people can't work, and that's fine. And then they need the support that they need. But the system has got over bloated. I'm not convinced this bill is what's going to unbloat it. That's the point I'm making. So I am sympathetic, broadly speaking, with some even of the Liz Kendall and Wes Streeting at the health side of saying that there are, something's gone terribly wrong, that so many people are on the sick. There is a problem, a social and cultural one, I'd say. And so I get irritated by this bill because it's trying to deal with what everybody suspects is something that's gone wrong in terms of a broad culture of welfare dependency. But then by going in on kind of low-hanging fruit in a way with absolute, a hammer to crack a nut.
Well, it is. It's blaming individuals, and it is blaming individuals even where it's error, and even when it's error by the DWP and not their error at all, like you say, that they've overpaid it. But still, it comes back to the individual and surveying their bank account, getting the money back off them, instead of looking at I completely agree with you. I think there's perverse incentives to stay on the benefit system, and particularly for sickness benefits, there are perverse incentives to carry on thinking of yourself as sick or disabled in some way and interacting with the system on that basis, because then it becomes quite clear what you get, and it's not that it's necessarily massive amounts of money, but you kind of know where you are. But I did think it was really interesting, actually. I read the House of Lords briefing about it. It said that one of the large proportions of fraudulent claiming was people understating their earned income when they were on universal credit. And that's just an illustration of that. People want to work. And universal credit was supposed to be this great thing that would enable people to avoid that trap of I'm now getting more from benefits than I could earn. But in fact, it doesn't work like that you start to earn and then they just take it all away off your benefit. So then you think, well, I could end up actually worse off here and with a less predictable income if I'm on part-time work.
And then it also can affect another benefit along the way. And so that's what happens is then it's suddenly like, oh God, no, I might lose housing benefit as well and all this. So
get the free prescription.
Yeah, exactly.
All that kind of thing. And so I agree with you. I think there's a lot of perverse incentives there. And to get rid of those would help more people out of the benefits trap quicker. But of course, it would also cost money. So,
well, but it's also when I look at the amounts of money that are likely to be saved by this, they are peanuts. Now, I as I say, I'm not advocating because I don't believe that it would be right to allow people to rip off the system and say, oh, well, it's only peanuts, so it doesn't matter. It's just that there's an awful lot going into this bill. And it's sold. I mean, they sort of might say it's all hyperbole, saying bank spank, but there's a lot of hyperbole around this bill. This is the crackdown on welfare bill. And actually, I'm not convinced they're going to get that much back. And it's also the case, by the way, a lot of it's speculative in terms of finance, in terms of what they can get. So, we don't know. They're sort of saying, we suspect. I mean, at one point, they actually say something like, there's this much fraud going on that worth this much money, to the taxpayer. But we suspect it's a lot more than that. It's like, well, I bet you do. But that's like one of those, because you walk around thinking we're all ripping everyone off, right? Mm-hmm. But you can't just sort of say, we think it's more, so we'll get more back. Mm. And that justifies this. Anyway, final comments.
Well, to your point about the effectiveness of the powers, the government's own assessment of all of this is that the bank's buying powers are going to recuperate 1.4% of annual fraud and error. And it raises a question, do we want to give up the entire population's privacy rights to recoup that amount of money? There's also a problem on the side of ineffectiveness because when the way the powers are set up is that you can only look at the account that to which the individual is receiving the benefit. And so say a fraudster had their benefit coming into their Lloyds account, but they had £16,000 in their HSBC account. There's a real question about whether that would actually even be picked up by these powers. So there's a serious loophole here. And if you want to genuinely tackle fraud and error, I agree, there are much better ways to do it than these bank spying powers.
Okay, great. Timandra, your final thought.
I think, unfortunately, this is quite a typical example of the way governments aim to tackle problems which tend to be much broader social and political problems. It's got technology in it. They're like, oh, we're going to automate it with algorithms. It's being outsourced to private non-governmental institutions, in this case banks. And at the blunt end are individuals, often not the individuals with a lot of control over what's going on, and often the individuals who are in the most vulnerable situations in society.
I think that's right. And just to remind us that, during the anti-lockdown protests in Canada, the banks acted, closed down people's bank accounts under government diktat, who were protesting against mandated vaccines. There's been controversies about debanking around political issues. The likes of Nigel Farage and so on have made a big fuss about it, but it definitely happened to other organisations as well. So what I mean is control of your finances, it really is something that's quite intimate, isn't it? It's your bank. You just don't expect, you shred it's the one thing, you shred your bank statements. It's not like you want people to know, and you kind of feel like, it's like going to the doctor. You don't expect the doctor to distribute widely your medical history or the bank to distribute or play around with your data. And we're all suspicious some of that might go on. But when we see the government telling the banks to behave beyond their remit, against their desire, the banks haven't asked for this power. They've been told you have to do it in order to carry on operating as a financial institution in this country. I think that we can all be nervous because I just feel that a lot of times there are things going on behind your and my back. And so anyway, to conclude on this, if you, this should go out on the day or the day after there's been a second reading for this in the House of Lords, where I will have spoken. I mean, I'll probably get 3 or 4 minutes, and you'll be all wishing that it was Jasleen or Timandra who was doing the speech, because mine won't be as good as with the detail that they've brought and the insight they brought today. But nonetheless, I would urge you to absolutely keep your eye on this bill and often the boring sounding bills or Trojan horses for some real nasty stuff. I also wanted to just thank Timandra and Jasleen. Jasleen, what we will do is, if you're only watching this on YouTube, which great that you're signed on to the YouTube channel, that's great. But also we're going to put it out on our free Substack. And if you aren't yet signed up to that, then please sign up to the Academy of Ideas free Substack. And we will put in the Substack the briefing that Big Brother Watch have done for this and any of the relevant material. And I hope that you, Jasleen, will be able to keep us informed of anything the campaign's doing. You have been doing a lot of work, and if maybe you can just finish off. Any plans, or are you just waiting to see what happens in the Lords now? Are you still trying to gather some momentum around this?
We're gathering as much momentum as we can. We're fighting hard to challenge the powers. And what would be great if you could all do is to write to Baroness Sherlock, who is leading the bill in the Lords. We're putting together a write to the government tool on our website. And if you can express your concerns, if you're as concerned about this bill as we are, that would be incredibly helpful too.
Okay, brilliant. That's a very practical outcome. Thank you very much indeed, both of you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Fabulous.
How long?